Margaret Chen had done everything right, every single thing. She'd saved for 12 years to buy this house in Riverside, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a quarter-acre of land, and most importantly, a swimming pool. The pool was her sanctuary. After 43 years of working double shifts at the hospital as a nurse, dealing with suffering and loss and the endless weight of human fragility, the pool was where she could stand in her backyard at dusk, watching the sun paint the water gold, and simply breathe. She'd spent that first summer after purchase tiling the deck herself, installing solar lighting, creating a small garden of jasmine and lavender around the perimeter. Every dollar invested, every blister on her hands, every sore muscle. It was all a meditation on finally having something that was entirely hers. Then the teenagers discovered it. It started 3 weeks into July. Margaret was inside making dinner when she heard the splash, a sound so sudden and wrong in the evening quiet that she actually dropped her wooden spoon. She hurried to the sliding glass door and froze. 5 teenagers, none of whom she recognized, were in her pool. 2 boys and 3 girls, all somewhere between 16 and 18, moving through the water with the unself-conscious ease of kids who'd never been told no and believed they never would be. Margaret's first instinct was anger. Her second was caution. She was a 5'3" woman living alone, and there were 5 of them. She grabbed her phone and opened the sliding door. "Excuse me," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady and firm. "This is private property. You need to leave." The teenagers didn't even pause. One of the boys, tall, with the kind of casual confidence that comes from a lifetime of not experiencing consequences, actually waved at her like she was an amusing auntie bringing snacks. "We'll be out in 20 minutes, missus." He didn't wait for her to finish. He dunked his head back under the water. Margaret felt her hands trembling. She walked back inside and called the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher was kind but clear. Without evidence of property damage or threatening behavior, officers would take time to arrive, and by then the teenagers would likely be gone. Did she want to file a report anyway? She did. Then she watched from her bedroom window as the teenagers eventually climbed out, wrapped themselves in towels they'd brought, like they were planning this, and disappeared down the street. She found wet footprints tracking across her deck. She mopped them up and told herself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. 3 days later, they came back. This time there were 7 of them. Margaret called the police again. Again, by the time anyone could respond, the teenagers had vanished. The dispatcher, a different one, made it clear that without clear trespassing violations or violent threats, police couldn't really do much. "Have you considered putting up a fence?" the dispatcher suggested gently. A fence? Margaret had no budget for a fence. She had a mortgage, property taxes, and she'd just replaced the pool pump. A fence would cost $5,000 she didn't have. Over the next 2 weeks, the trespassing became a routine. The teenagers, she began to recognize the same faces, would show up between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. like it was a public facility. They'd arrive in 2 cars, leave their keys and wallets on her loungers, and swim for hours. They brought friends. They brought music, playing it from a Bluetooth speaker with bass that made the water ripple. They left trash, beer cans, beer. In her pool area, plastic bottles, fast food wrappers. One night, Margaret found a condom floating in the deep end. That's when she stopped being afraid and started being strategic. She'd spent 43 years in healthcare learning about human physiology, chemistry, cause and effect. She'd learned that the body was a system, that certain substances caused predictable reactions, that intention married to knowledge could create consequences. She spent a Tuesday evening researching. Not on her home computer, she used the libraries. She learned about salt saturation, about how much sodium chloride you'd need to make water unswimmable, about osmotic pressure and skin irritation. She learned that high salinity wouldn't immediately harm someone, but it would make the experience deeply, intensely unpleasant. It would sting exposed skin, burn eyes, create a sensation of being violated in a way that teenagers from nice neighborhoods would remember forever. She also learned it was technically not illegal. It was her pool. Salt was a common de-icer. She could claim, if asked, that she was experimenting with salt water conversion. Margaret began buying pool salt. Not all at once, which would look suspicious, but gradually. 20 bags here, 30 bags there, from different stores, different counties. She stacked them in her garage behind the Christmas decorations no one would ever see. She had a plan now, and it steadied her. Plans were something she understood. In nursing, a plan meant you weren't a victim of circumstances, you were a professional managing a situation. The teenagers came back on a Friday night. 10 of them this time. Margaret watched from her kitchen, heart pounding but calm now as they stripped down and jumped in. They were laughing, carefree, their laughter carrying across the quiet neighborhood. One girl with long, dark hair actually dove from the deep end, arcing through the air like she owned it. This was the night. Margaret set her phone on the counter with the timer running. She'd give them 30 minutes to get truly into the water, to get their hair wet, to submerge themselves completely. Then she'd activate the plan. She spent those 30 minutes doing dishes, methodical, focused. The way she prepared for surgery, compartmentalize, execute, don't think about the weight of what you're doing until after it's done. The kitchen clock read 7:47 p.m. when she set down the dish towel, dried her hands, and walked to the garage. The bags of pool salt were heavy, but Margaret was stronger than she looked. Nurses learned to be. She loaded 6 bags into a wheelbarrow, backed into the driveway with it, and positioned herself at the pool's edge where the teenagers couldn't see her from inside the water. "Hey," one of the boys shouted, spotting her. "Mrs. Chen, we're just—" She didn't respond. She opened the first bag and began pouring. The white granules hit the water like snow, dissolving instantly, the chemical reaction beginning immediately. "Whoa, what are you doing?" Another teenager, one she recognized from previous nights, had swum toward the shallow end. "What is that?" "Salt," Margaret said calmly, pouring the second bag. "Lots and lots of salt." For a moment, nothing happened. The teenagers continued to tread water, processing what they were seeing. Then the first one came, a boy who'd been floating on his back. He suddenly jerked upright, his face contorting. "Oh my God," he gasped. "Oh my God, it burns." Then all of them seemed to realize simultaneously what was happening. The water's salinity was rising rapidly now, past the threshold of discomfort. One of the girls started screaming, clawing at her eyes. Another boy tried to climb out, but the pool tiles were slick and he slipped, going under, taking a mouthful of salt water and surfacing choking and sobbing. "What did you do to us?" The long-haired girl was shrieking, thrashing now, her voice cracking with panic and pain. "What is happening?" Margaret kept pouring. The teenagers were scrambling now, no longer the confident trespassers, becoming something rower and more honest, children in pain and afraid. One boy made it to the ladder and hauled himself out, his skin already showing red welts, his eyes streaming. He collapsed on the deck, gasping, "It's in my eyes, it's burning." "Stop, please stop," one of the girls pleaded, her voice breaking. She was trying to swim toward the edge, but the increasing salinity was making it harder to stay submerged, her body wanting to float higher. We're sorry, please." Margaret opened the third bag. Within 5 minutes, the pool had transformed from a sanctuary they'd violated into something hostile and alien. The teenagers who could move were scrambling out now, collapsing on the deck, rolling in the grass trying to relieve the burning sensation on their skin. Those still in the water were panicking, trying to climb out, the salt now making their eyes and any cuts they had scream with pain. The long-haired girl was crying openly now, real tears mixing with pool water, her mascara running black down her cheeks. "Why?" she was sobbing. "Why would you?" "You didn't ask permission," Margaret said quietly, opening the fourth bag. "I did ask you to leave, repeatedly. You chose not to listen." A boy, maybe 17, with a sunburned nose, stumbled out of the water, his skin flushed and irritated. He looked at her with an expression she'd never forget. Absolute shock that consequences were real, that adults could have agency, that his actions could create a response that wasn't an apology or a warning but actual pain. "My dad's a lawyer," he gasped, coughing. "You're insane, he's going to sue you so hard." "For what?" Margaret asked calmly. "Securing my property? Salt is not a controlled substance. I've done nothing illegal, but you broke into someone's home. Yes, trespassing is breaking and entering, and now you're all going to have a night you remember. And maybe, just maybe, next time you want to use something that isn't yours, you'll think twice." She poured the fifth and sixth bags. By now, all 10 teenagers had managed to get out of the water. They were scattered across the deck and yard, some on their hands and knees, some standing and trying to rinse with the hose, all of them in genuine distress. One girl was calling her mother, her voice high and panicked. 2 boys were arguing about whether they should call an ambulance. Margaret set down the empty bags and walked back inside. She locked the sliding glass door. Through the window, she watched them. She watched them rinse themselves with the garden hose, watched them argue about whether this was serious, watched the reality of consequence settle over them like a fog. She watched the long-haired girl, who'd seemed so arrogant just minutes ago, sit down on the edge of the pool deck and put her head in her hands, shoulders shaking. She felt a strange, complicated mix of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also something darker. Something that looked a lot like rage, but also looked a lot like power, and Margaret wasn't entirely sure they were different things. By the time the teenagers had mostly recovered enough to function, it was nearly 9 p.m. They gathered their things slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of people who'd been through something they didn't understand. A few of them kept looking back at Margaret's house, at the figure visible through the window, as if trying to reconcile her with what she'd done. The boy with the sunburned nose paused at the end of the driveway, still flushed, his eyes still visibly irritated. "You can't just poison people," he called out. "I didn't poison anyone," Margaret called back through the glass. "I protected my property, and I highly suggest you all take a shower, soon. The salt water dries and keeps burning." She watched them pile into their cars. She watched them drive away. Then Margaret sat down on her kitchen floor and realized her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from the intoxicating realization of how much power she'd actually had all along. She'd spent so much of her life helping people, being kind, following rules, deferring to authority. And it had taken exactly one night of not doing those things to realize something. Sometimes the kindest people knew exactly how to hurt, because they understood the body, understood systems, understood exactly where to apply pressure. She stood up, walked to the pool, and looked at the now hostile, turbid water. It would take days to rebalance it, to dilute the salt, to make it hers again. But for tonight, it was the safest it had ever been. Two officers, one younger with the careful posture of someone still learning the job, one older with the expression of someone who'd seen variations of every conflict before. Margaret had been sitting on her back porch with coffee, watching the pool water, which had already started developing a hazy, almost opalescent quality in the early light. She didn't run, didn't hide. She made eye contact as they approached, their shoes crunching on the gravel path. "Mrs. Chen," the older officer asked. His nameplate read Martinez. "Yes. We received a complaint from the parents of 10 minors who claim you deliberately contaminated a pool they were swimming in last night, resulting in chemical burns and ocular damage." Margaret set down her coffee. First, they weren't swimming, they were trespassing. Second, it's salt. Common pool salt that you can buy at any hardware store. Third, chemical burns and ocular damage are dramatic descriptions for a saline irritation that's uncomfortable but not dangerous. The younger officer was glancing at the pool, then back at her, his jaw tight. But Martinez was watching her face. "You admitted to deliberately adding salt to the water knowing they were in it." "I added salt to secure my property against trespassers," Margaret corrected. "The fact that they were in the water at that moment was their choice and their negligence. They were illegally on my property. They'd been warned." "By you." "Multiple times. And by the police." Margaret hesitated. "The police explained they couldn't arrive quickly enough to make a difference, so I made my own arrangements." Martinez exchanged a glance with his younger partner. There was something almost sad in the older officer's expression, like he was looking at a puzzle that didn't quite fit the frames available to solve it. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be straightforward with you. The family of one of these minors is represented by an attorney. They're considering pressing charges for assault with a corrosive substance and intentional harm to minors." "I've done neither," Margaret said calmly. "I've secured my private property. If they choose to enter my pool again, they'll face the same conditions. I'm not breaking any laws." The younger officer couldn't seem to help himself. "You're literally poisoning water that you know people will enter." "I'm salinating water on my property," Margaret interrupted, not unkindly. "If someone chooses to enter water without the owner's permission, and that water is in an undesirable condition, that's trespassing and assumption of risk, not a crime by me." Martinez was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Hendersons, you know their son Tyler, 16-year-old, plays lacrosse." "I don't know any of their names." "Well, their lawyer is already drafting charges. But here's what I wanted to tell you before it gets official. They're also probably going to have a hard time. Because, and this will come out in court if it goes that far, they broke into your backyard, used your pool without permission multiple times after being told to leave. You documented it with police reports. You didn't physically hurt anyone. You created an unpleasant condition in your own water. He paused, letting that land. It's not going to be a slam-dunk case for them, but it's also not going to be a slam-dunk case for you. A jury hears she put salt in water with kids in it, and they might not like the sound of that, legality be damned. You might win, but you'll spend 15 grand on a lawyer getting there. And your name is going to be all over the internet as the woman who poisoned teenagers. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. The internet. She'd been living so much in the specific architecture of her own home, her own violation, her own rage, that she hadn't thought about the broader structure of public opinion. I did what I had to do, she said. I believe you, Martinez said, and she thought he actually might. But that doesn't mean there won't be a price. After the officers left, Margaret sat very still on her porch. The morning was getting warm, the sun climbing higher. A neighbor's wind chimes danced in the breeze. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, but the world had fundamentally shifted. She'd swung from victim to perpetrator in the eyes of everyone who mattered, even though she'd never left her own property. Her phone started buzzing around 10 a.m. First, it was a local news station requesting an interview. She declined. Then a second station. Then 3 emails from lawyers she'd never contacted offering representation. Then Reddit posts spread across multiple subreddits. Woman weaponizes pool against teenagers, and is this self-defense or assault? The discourse was split, but harsh either way. Either she was a hero standing against entitled kids, or she was a psychopath who nearly gave a teenager a chemical injury. By noon, a video from one of the teenagers had gone viral on TikTok. Shaky phone footage of teenagers in a pool, their faces contorting, someone screaming, and then the caption. Lady literally tried to poison us for swimming in her pool, lol, this is insane. The video had 2.3 million views by 1 p.m. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and read the comments. She's actually a monster. Those kids deserved it, they were trespassing. Imagine being so privileged you think poisoning children is okay. She gave them saline irritation. Calm down, this is hilarious. This woman should go to prison. Those teenagers are entitled brats who don't respect property. Somewhere in the cacophony, Margaret lost track of which comments were true and which were performative, which were justice and which were cruelty. Around 2 p.m., she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something in her made her pick up. Mrs. Chen, a woman's voice, controlled and professional. My name is Patricia Huang. I'm an attorney representing the Henderson family in connection with an incident involving your pool. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. I'm calling to inform you that we're pursuing criminal charges for assault with a corrosive substance and a civil suit for damages including medical expenses, pain and suffering, and emotional trauma. We're also requesting that you drain and professionally treat your pool per safety codes before you open it to any use. Do you have representation? I'm not guilty of any crime, Margaret said. That will be determined in court. My advice, as a courtesy, would be to retain a lawyer immediately. Response deadline is Monday. The call ended. Margaret set the phone down and looked around her kitchen. The granite countertops she'd saved 3 years to afford. The stainless steel appliances bought on a payment plan. Everything she'd built, suddenly provisional. There was a knock on the door around 4 p.m. Margaret opened it to find a woman roughly her age, with kind eyes and the kind of casual dread that comes from facing an awkward conversation. Hi, the woman said. I'm Sarah. I live 2 houses down. I wanted to talk to you about what happened. Margaret's first instinct was to close the door, but something in Sarah's expression suggested she wasn't here to yell. Come in, Margaret said. Sarah settled at the kitchen table with a cup of tea Margaret offered, the ritual of hospitality even now. For a moment, neither spoke. I have teenagers, Sarah finally said. 2 of them, and I love them, but they can be thoughtless, entitled sometimes. When I heard about what happened, my first thought was anger at you, because that could have been my kids, you know. But, Margaret prompted. But then I thought, if my kids kept breaking into someone's yard and I kept telling them to stop, and the police kept saying they couldn't do anything, and then I got painted as the villain for finally protecting what was mine, I think I might have done something similar. Maybe not salt water, but something. Margaret felt tears prickling her eyes without warning, the first time since last night. Everyone on the internet thinks I'm a monster. Everyone on the internet is a mob, Sarah said gently. They'll move on to the next outrage in 48 hours, but the people in your actual neighborhood, most of us know those kids have been trespassing. We've seen them. We've heard the noise. She paused. You're not a monster. You're a woman who tried to ask nicely, and when that didn't work, you got creative. I don't think that makes you evil. The lawyer says they're pressing charges. Yeah, I know. My husband's a lawyer too, actually. Different firm, but he said the same thing Martinez said. It'll be messy, but you might be okay. They have a harder case than they think they do. After Sarah left, Margaret felt something in her chest loosen slightly. Not relief exactly, but a sense that she wasn't entirely alone in this, that someone who'd had every reason to condemn her had chosen empathy instead. By evening, the news cycle had picked up the story. Local channels ran it as a summer clash over property rights angle. One network interviewed a legal expert who said the case was genuinely unclear. Both parties have legitimate grievances. Another interviewed a psychiatrist who speculated about revenge as a form of restoring power without naming Margaret specifically, but clearly referencing her. The Hendersons gave a statement through their lawyer. We're devastated by what happened to our son. We trusted our community was safe. We're pursuing all available legal remedies to ensure justice. Margaret gave no statement. She'd learned by then that anything she said would be weaponized, reframed, used against her. She spent the evening draining the pool. It was a procedure that took hours, valves, hoses, the methodical release of her sanctuary back into the earth. With each gallon that drained, something drained from her too. Not regret, exactly. She still believed those teenagers needed consequences. But something like the clean certainty of righteous anger was curdling into something more complicated. She'd won the battle, but might be losing the war. By 9 p.m., the pool was empty. The concrete bottom looked obscene, naked, and exposed like a wound. Margaret stood at the edge of it and realized that the invasion had won after all, not by continuing to trespass, but by making her feel as though she'd violated something sacred by defending it. Her phone buzzed. Another news outlet, another lawyer, another 1,000 angry or supportive comments from strangers who'd never met her and never would. Margaret turned off her phone and went to bed. The real consequences, she knew, hadn't arrived yet. They were still coming. The suit, the criminal charges, the trial. And underneath all of that, the most destructive consequence of all, the loss of a single night where she could look at her own actions and not feel a creeping doubt about whether she'd become the kind of person she'd always tried not to be. His name was David Roth, and he came recommended by 3 different people, a good sign, or so she'd been told. His office was in a professional building downtown, all glass and chrome, and the kind of minimalist design that was meant to convey that he didn't waste time on frivolous things like comfort or warmth. David was 55, with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who'd seen enough human behavior to be unshockable. He reviewed the police reports, watched the TikTok video, read through the Henderson family's formal complaint, and then looked at Margaret over his reading glasses. You did exactly what you're accused of, he said, and you have no legal defense beyond it's my pool. That's not true, Margaret protested. It's my property. Your property with people in it that you knew were going to be there. That's the problem. If you drained it and refilled it tomorrow morning before anyone arrived, we'd have a stronger case. But you activated the salt while they were in the water, deliberately. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. I told them to leave. Multiple times, yes. And if this were just about property rights, that would matter more. But it becomes a different case when minors are injured, even minor injuries, and you were the knowing cause. He set down the complaint. The good news is the Henderson family's lawyer overplayed their hand. Chemical burns and ocular damage, when we're talking about saline irritation, is a credibility problem. A doctor's report will almost certainly conclude these were temporary irritations with no lasting damage. That actually helps us. So I won't face charges. The criminal complaint will likely be dropped or pleaded down to something minor, or the case will fall apart in preliminary hearing. Civil suit is different, and that's where they can really hurt you financially. He leaned back. What I want to know is, was this really about them trespassing, or was there something else? Margaret started to respond with her planned answer, the reasonable explanation. Then she stopped. I was afraid, she heard herself say. They kept coming back, the police wouldn't help, I tried to ask nicely, and they laughed at me. Literally laughed and waved like I was some harmless old woman making a fuss. She paused. And then one night I realized I wasn't. I had options, I had agency, and I used it. David nodded slowly. That's honest. That's also the kind of thing that plays poorly in court. The narrative they'll push is that you escalated from a nuisance to attempted harm. What we need to push is that you were a homeowner who had exhausted legal remedies and had every right to secure your property as you saw fit. But that's not why I did it. I know, David said quietly, but that's why the law cares about it. Over the next week, Margaret learned that the internet's attention span was indeed finite. The story dropped off the front page of Reddit by Wednesday. By Friday, TikTok had moved on to newer outrages. But the local news carried the story forward, especially after the Henderson family gave an interview showing their son Tyler to the cameras, 16 years old, still showing slight redness around his eyes, speaking carefully about the trauma of being attacked by an adult I trusted to be a neighbor. Watching him, Margaret felt a specific kind of guilt that didn't erase her anger but lived alongside it, equally insistent. Then on Saturday morning, something changed. A Reddit user with the username upoolsleuth had posted in the subreddit r/justice, served with a different angle. It was a detailed breakdown of the Henderson family's own legal history, gleaned from public records. Court documents showing that Tyler had been charged with vandalism 2 years earlier, charges dropped. Police reports indicating that there had been at least 8 other complaints about the family's teenagers trespassing on various properties over the past 18 months. And perhaps most damaging, a high school suspension for Tyler involving aggressive behavior toward another student. The post exploded immediately. Suddenly the narrative shifted. The teenagers weren't innocent victims, they were a pattern. They weren't stumbling into a private pool by accident, they were serially trespassing across the neighborhood. And Margaret wasn't an unprovoked villain, she was one of many people they'd wronged. Comments started appearing. Wait, the Henderson kid has history. How is the media not covering that? This is what happens when rich parents don't teach their kids consequences. Mrs. Chen should have done this sooner. The Henderson family is clearly gaslighting everyone about who the real problem is. Margaret sat in her kitchen and read these comments and felt something strange, validated and nauseated at the same time. By Sunday, someone had leaked the school suspensions. By Monday, a local news station interviewed 3 other neighbors who'd had run-ins with the Henderson teenagers. By Tuesday, the tone had completely reversed. Now Margaret was the cautious homeowner who'd finally stood up to serial trespassers, and the Henderson family was the entitled rich family whose kids had faced no consequences until now. She received flowers from 3 different neighbors. One had a card that read, "Thank you for doing what the police wouldn't. The Chens, no relation, but we understand." David called her Wednesday morning. "The Henderson family is offering a settlement," he said. $20,000 to you, signed NDA, mutual non-disparagement clause. "They're paying me," Margaret felt dizzy. "They want this to go away. They realized their lawyer made a mess of the narrative, and they're looking at a settlement that will cost them less than trial. Plus, if this goes to trial, their family history comes out. It's bad for them. It's worse for their business." "What business?" "Real estate development. Apparently the father sits on several zoning boards. Public perception matters to them. They'd rather pay you than be the family that let their kids harass a neighbor and then sued her for stopping it." Margaret's moral universe felt like it was rotating again, realigning. The narrative kept shifting depending on what information emerged, what story was being told, who was doing the telling. "What do I want to do?" she asked. "From a legal standpoint, take it. It's clean money, it makes the case go away, and you avoid the publicity nightmare of trial. And from a personal standpoint." David paused. "I think you should know what you learned before you decide." Margaret didn't take the settlement immediately. Instead, she did something she'd been avoiding. She looked up the families online. The Hendersons weren't wealthy in the way she'd imagined. Not generational money, not the kind of obvious privilege. The father, Robert Henderson, owned a mid-sized real estate development firm focused on suburban residential projects. The mother, Jennifer, was involved in various charitable boards. They lived in a house that was maybe $100K more than Margaret's, in a neighborhood that was nicer but not substantially so. On their family's social media, which they'd made private after the incident, but the internet had already archived everything. There were pictures of Tyler at lacrosse tournaments, at school dances, at family vacations. He looked like just another teenager, nothing particularly privileged or hateful about his expression. Just a kid who'd made bad choices. Margaret looked up the other teenagers too. She found their social media, their family information, their school records when they were public. They were varied, some from wealthy families, some from working-class ones. The long-haired girl, whose name was Sarah Marie Chen, a different Chen entirely, had a mother who was a single parent working as a dental assistant. Her Instagram showed volunteer work at an animal shelter. She didn't seem like a monster either. But they'd still come back to Margaret's pool night after night despite being told to leave. They'd still laughed in her face. They'd still treated her property like it was theirs for the taking. The moral clarity Margaret had felt that night pouring the salt, the sense that she was teaching necessary lessons, started to fracture under the weight of actual complexity. Thursday evening, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway. "Mrs. Chen, hi, my name is Jessica Price. I'm Sarah Marie Chen's mother." The woman's voice was hesitant. I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to talk to you before the settlement stuff gets finalized." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Okay." Sarah Marie is? She's a good kid. She struggles with social anxiety, actually. The group of kids she's been hanging with, they push her toward things she'd never do on her own. I keep telling her that, and she keeps not listening because that's what 17-year-olds do. I think you probably know that better than most people, having been one yourself. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, not unkindly. "I want you to know that what happened to her, it was scary. It was painful. But I also think it might be the best thing that's happened to her in a while, because now she's actually listening to me about the company she keeps." Jessica paused. "I'm not defending her for trespassing. I'm not defending the Henderson family's response, which has been to blame you entirely. But I wanted to tell you that sometimes the hardest lessons come with the most salt in the water, and I'm grateful she learned hers before it got much worse." After Jessica hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen and cried, not from regret, but from the complicated realization that she could have been right about the necessity of consequences and still wrong about the method. Or at least wrong about believing the method contained only justice and not also cruelty. The settlement was finalized the following Monday. Margaret met with David at his office. She signed the documents, accepted the check, and was informed that she could never speak publicly about the incident in a way that disparaged the Henderson family. She could tell the truth in court if subpoenaed, but beyond that, the incident was to be locked away. $20,000 for her hurt feelings, her violated sanctuary, her power reclaimed. It felt simultaneously like too much and not enough. She walked out of David's office and sat in her car for 30 minutes before starting the engine. The pool at home was still empty, the concrete skeleton of it waiting to be refilled. She could drain the salt slowly, refill it over time, make it hers again. Or she could fill it with something different. Margaret made a decision. She stood at the spigot with the hose in hand, watching the water level climb, and made a choice she wouldn't have made 2 months earlier. Instead of salt, she added nothing. Instead of barriers, she called the city parks department. She hired a contractor to fence in the perimeter, not a tall fortress of a fence, but a 4-foot decorative wrought iron that made a clear boundary without being aggressive. It took her exactly 1 week and most of the settlement money to install. On the day it was finished, Margaret stood in her yard looking at the transformation. The pool was still hers, but now it was distinctly bounded, claimed but not weaponized, protected but not hostile. She was still sitting on the patio that evening when she heard a voice from the street. "Mrs. Chen." It was Tyler Henderson. He was standing outside the fence, his hands in his pockets, wearing an expression that combined dread with determination. He looked younger than he had in the interview, more like an actual 16-year-old and less like a soundbite. Margaret's first instinct was caution. Her second was to listen. "Hi," she said, not inviting him in. "I wanted to." Tyler stopped, restarted. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for trespassing on your property, for not respecting your boundaries, for laughing at you." He paused, gathering courage. "My parents made me do community service as part of the settlement. I've been volunteering at the community center, helping with the afternoon programs, and I think I've been thinking about things differently." Margaret waited, Teenagers needed space to finish their sentences. "I didn't think of you as a real person, I think," Tyler continued. "You were just like an obstacle to work around, a neighbor. And then you did what you did, and I was scared, and in the shower afterward, when I could still feel the salt burning, I suddenly realized that you must have felt that scared too. About us being in your space, about not being listened to." He looked directly at her then. "I get it now." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't a legal victory or a viral moment. It was just a teenager understanding, however imperfectly, the human being he'd treated as background noise. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "I'm not going to pretend I regret what I did, but I'm also not proud of all of it." "Yeah," Tyler said. "I think that's honest. Thank you for teaching me even the hard way." He walked away before she could respond, his hands still in his pockets but his shoulders a little lighter. August turned into September, and the pool remained unsalted and open to no one but Margaret. She swam every evening at dusk, watching the light change from gold to pink to purple. The fence stood sentinel, transforming the space from something violated into something deliberately enclosed. She found it was easier to breathe in the pool now, knowing that the boundary was literal instead of contested. She'd returned to work at the hospital, settling back into the rhythm of 12-hour shifts and the constant low-grade ache of caring for people in crisis. One night during a shift, she ran into Carlos, one of her colleagues, in the break room. "You okay?" he asked, studying her face. "You've seemed different since August." "Just trying to figure out how to be myself," Margaret said. "Who I thought I was versus who I actually am when I'm pushed far enough." Carlos nodded like he understood, but she suspected he didn't. Most people hadn't met themselves in that particular way, the moment when civility fell away and showed you something harder underneath. By mid-September, news of the pool fence and its implications had somehow circulated back to the neighborhood. Sarah, her neighbor, brought over a pie one evening. "I heard you got a fence," Sarah said, handing it over. "Apple pie. I wanted to celebrate that, the return to normalcy." "Is that what this is?" Margaret asked, setting the pie on the counter. "Normalcy." "I think it's whatever comes after," Sarah said. "After the chaos, when you've learned something about yourself and decided to live with it instead of fight it." They sat on Margaret's porch, sharing pie and coffee, and Margaret found herself telling Sarah things she hadn't told anyone. Her fear in those early days, her intoxication when she'd realized she had power, her horror when she understood what the internet would do with her story, her relief when the truth began to emerge that wasn't the simple narrative anyone had wanted. "I don't regret the salt," Margaret said finally, "but I also don't think I'd do it the same way again." "That's growth," Sarah said. "That's not satisfaction, but it's something more mature." By October, the neighborhood had completely moved on. The teenagers found other places to swim, a public pool, an apartment complex with a community facility, the beach during summer weekends. None of them came back to Margaret's fence. She'd run into Sarah Marie at the grocery store one day, pushing a cart with her mother. The girl's eyes widened slightly, the kind of micro-recognition that comes from having experienced something intense with someone. She nodded politely at Margaret, and Margaret nodded back. That was enough. But by November, something shifted again, and this time it came from an unexpected direction. Margaret received a letter from the County Board of Supervisors. She almost threw it away, assuming it was some kind of notice, until she saw her name written in careful handwriting on the envelope. Inside was an invitation to speak at a community forum about property rights, neighborhood safety, and de-escalation strategies. Someone on the board had been following the story, and they wanted to hear from her directly. She almost declined. Public speaking, media attention, she'd had enough of both. But David, when she called him for advice, said something that made her pause. "This is your chance to tell your story instead of letting other people tell it. Not the salt part if you don't want to, but the part about what it feels like when no one listens, when your space is violated, when the systems that are supposed to protect you fail. That matters. That's important." Margaret attended the forum on a Tuesday evening in the middle of November. It was held in the high school auditorium, and there were maybe 200 people in attendance. The board members sat at a long table at the front. Margaret was asked to sit in a chair facing them, as if she were being examined rather than consulted, and that discomfort never quite went away. But when she spoke, she found words she hadn't known she had. When people are ignored, when their boundaries are repeatedly violated, and when systems designed to protect them fail, they look for alternatives, she said. Some of them are good, some are legal, some are constructive, and some are destructive. I chose destructively. I also chose that way because I felt I had no other choice. But I did have another choice, and I think that's the important thing to talk about because the next person in my situation might not be as fortunate as I was. They might hurt someone in a way that can't be undone. The board members were quiet, listening in a way that felt genuine. What I needed, Margaret continued, was not to have to poison my own well to make someone listen. I needed enforcement. I needed a boundary. And I got those things, but I had to make them myself, which shouldn't be how it works in a functioning community. After the forum, 3 people approached her with their own stories of trespassing, of invasion, of the helplessness of being unheard. One woman had dealt with it for 3 years. Another man asked her specifically what she'd recommend as an alternative to what she'd done. Honestly, Margaret said, I wish I knew. A fence eventually, legal representation, neighbors who believed me, all of that cost me time and money I didn't have. The best advice I can give is document everything from day one. Don't wait until you're angry enough to do something you're not sure about. That way lies complication. By December, Margaret had settled into a version of herself that felt honest if not entirely comfortable. She'd started reading about home security systems, about legal frameworks for property rights, about de-escalation techniques, all the things she wished she'd known in July. She donated part of the settlement to a legal aid fund for people who couldn't afford lawyers. She'd given an interview to a local lawyer who was writing an article about property rights for a legal magazine, speaking carefully within the bounds of her NDA. The neighborhood itself had evolved too. The other residents had started organizing, formalizing patrols, installing cameras, creating a network of communication that made trespassing harder and consequences more certain. It was the system working, eventually, after it had failed for so long that someone had to break it to make it work. Tyler Henderson occasionally ran past her house during his morning workouts, and once he waved. Margaret waved back. She didn't know if he'd been fundamentally changed by his experience or if he'd simply learned to be more careful. She suspected it was the latter, and that was probably fine. One evening in mid-December, Margaret sat by her pool with a glass of wine and reflected on the year. She'd been invaded. She'd retaliated. She'd been vilified and then vindicated and then villainized again, but differently. She'd learned that power came with a cost, that revenge tasted like salt and like something else, something darker that didn't have a name but had a weight. She'd installed a fence and called it self-defense, and in a sense it was. But it was also an acknowledgement that you couldn't salt your way to peace. Peace required boundaries, required enforcement, required others to respect what you'd marked as yours. The pool reflected the December stars. It was cold now, not meant for swimming, just meant for existing. A marker of space claimed and kept and finally allowed to be just a pool again instead of a battleground. Margaret drained her wine and went inside. Margaret had been back at work for months, had fallen into the rhythm of 12-hour shifts and the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for people in medical crisis. The hospital in winter was a different animal than the hospital in summer. More respiratory issues, more accidents on icy roads, more desperation layered beneath the fluorescent lights. It was on a quiet Tuesday night, around 2 a.m., when Margaret was charting patient observations that her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hi, Mrs. Chen, it's Sarah Marie. I got your number from my mom. I hope that's okay. I wanted to tell you that I got into the University of California, the environmental science program. I am being more careful about who I spend time with now. I wanted you to know that what you did maybe saved me from making bigger mistakes. I know you didn't intend that, but I wanted to say thank you. Margaret read the text 3 times. She responded, "That's wonderful news, Sarah Marie. I'm genuinely proud of you. Thank you for telling me." But the text sat with her through the rest of her shift, through her drive home as the sun was rising, through the coffee she made and didn't drink. The idea that her moment of rage and salt water had become, through some alchemy she didn't understand, formative instead of just destructive, it reframed things in a way she wasn't entirely comfortable with. By early January, something new was happening in the neighborhood. There were visitors to the pool now, not trespassers, but invited guests. Margaret had made a decision in late December that surprised even herself. She'd started a community swim program for the neighborhood teenagers who wanted it. It had started as a conversation with Tyler Henderson when he jogged past her house one morning, asking if she ever used the pool or if it just sat empty all winter. "I swim," Margaret had said, "but only at night alone." "That's sad," Tyler had said. "You have this beautiful pool and you're keeping it to yourself out of fear." The bluntness of it had stung because it was true. She had been using the pool as a refuge, a space protected from invasion. But in protecting it, she'd made it into something less, a museum of her violation instead of what it should have been, a place of joy. By the second week of January, Margaret had put up a community notice at the local recreation center and the high school. Interested teenagers could use her pool on Thursday evenings from 5-7 p.m., supervised with clear rules about respect and boundaries. No alcohol, no disrespect of property, no exceptions. In exchange, the teens helped maintain the pool, cleaning, chemicals, basic upkeep. The first Thursday, 12 teenagers showed up. Margaret had been nervous as she watched them file through the gate, half expecting something to go wrong. But these kids were different from the nighttime trespassers. They asked permission. They thanked her. One girl apologized simply because she was friends with Sarah Marie and wanted Margaret to know she understood why the earlier trespassing had been wrong. By the third week, there were 20 teenagers regularly coming. By February, there was a waiting list. Margaret found herself becoming not a gatekeeper protecting against invasion, but something closer to a mentor. She taught them about water safety, about respecting shared spaces, about what boundaries actually were and why they mattered. Some of them took to heart the more philosophical lessons. Most were just happy to have a place to swim. But the internet hadn't entirely forgotten about her. In early February, a YouTube creator with 1.2 million subscribers posted a video essay about the incident. It was titled, "The Homeowner Who Used Salt as a Weapon, Justice or Cruelty?" And it featured interviews with legal experts, the Henderson family's lawyer, who remained surprisingly professional despite the settlement, and footage from the original incident. The creator seemed to be trying for nuance, exploring both sides. But the result was that the story resurfaced on Reddit, on Twitter, on TikTok, and suddenly Margaret was back in the public consciousness. New comments flooded in. "Actually, I think she was right the entire time, and people were too sensitive." The Henderson kid seems genuinely remorseful now, which is weird, but also shows the salt actually worked. "Nobody's talking about how the police failed here. This woman had to become her own law enforcement. She literally assaulted teenagers and everyone's celebrating her. This is scary." But underneath the renewed controversy, something different seemed to be happening. People who'd experienced similar violations, trespassing, boundary violations, being unheard by authorities, were sharing their stories in the comments. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands. People saying, "I know exactly what you meant. I felt that helplessness." David called her the day after the video was posted. "Are you handling this okay?" he asked. "There's going to be some renewed attention." "I'm handling it," Margaret said. She was in her backyard watching two teenagers teach a younger kid how to do a proper cannonball. "It's strange, but I think I understand it differently now than I did last summer. I was part of a pattern, not an anomaly." "That's a more charitable interpretation than the law allows for," David said. "But I think you're right, and I want to tell you something. The Henderson family has decided to withdraw their NDA request from the settlement. You're free to talk about the case however you want now." "Why would they do that?" Margaret asked. "Because the new narrative, that their kid learned something and grew from it, is actually better for them than the narrative that's been developing online. Let me read you something from a statement Robert Henderson gave a journalist." David paused then. "We made a mistake in how we handled the incident last summer. Our son was in the wrong, and while we initially responded defensively, looking back, we believe that Mrs. Chen was justified in protecting her property. Our son has spent the last 6 months on community service and reflection, and he's a different person because of it. We're grateful to Mrs. Chen for teaching him a lesson that our parenting had failed to provide." Margaret felt something close to astonishment. That's generous." "It's actually smart," David said. "The Hendersons have decided the best way forward is to acknowledge the truth instead of fighting it. They're not defending their kid's behavior. They're accepting that his behavior had real consequences and that those consequences were ultimately good for him." By the time March arrived, Margaret had become something of a local figure. The swimming program had expanded to 40 teenagers on the Thursday list. She'd been invited to speak at another community forum, and this time she'd spoken about boundaries and community responsibility instead of just property rights. A local education nonprofit had asked her to participate in a panel about teenage accountability and learning from mistakes. She wasn't famous exactly, but she was known. People recognized her at the grocery store. Some thanked her. Some still seemed to regard her with a mix of fear and respect that made her slightly uncomfortable. The pool had become the space she'd originally dreamed of creating, a sanctuary, but a shared one. She swam alone in the mornings before dawn, when the water was still and the world was quiet. She supervised the teenagers in the evenings, watching them learn to respect boundaries by being given real responsibility within them. Sarah Marie came every Thursday when she was home from her first semester at UC Davis, helping Margaret teach the younger kids. Tyler ran past the pool regularly, and sometimes he stopped to watch the Thursday evening sessions, a quiet acknowledgement of the arc between them. In late April, Margaret received an email from a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Morales, who taught criminology and conflict resolution at the State University. She'd seen the YouTube video and wanted to interview Margaret for a research project about homeowners' responses to property violation and the gap between legal and extra-legal remedies. Margaret almost declined, but something about the email made her reconsider. The project was actually about helping communities create better systems so that people didn't feel driven to creative solutions. It was about understanding when people feel pushed to the edge and what legitimate systems they could activate instead. They met for coffee at a place near the university, and Dr. Morales was exactly what Margaret expected. Mid-50s, sharp mind, the kind of person who asked real questions and listened to real answers. "What I'm interested in," Dr. Morales said, "is the moment when you decided to use salt, what was going through your head in that specific instant." Margaret sat with the question, really sat with it, in a way she hadn't in months. "I realized I had power," she said finally. "I realized that my niceness, my compliance with the rules had bought me exactly nothing, and I realized that the people who'd violated my space did so because I was nice to them, and something in me just broke, or maybe it became clear. I'm not sure there's a difference. And now I think power is more useful when it's not expressed through escalation. I have power now. The teenagers know I'll enforce boundaries, and because I enforce them consistently and fairly, they respect them. But I didn't need salt water to create that. I needed clarity and consistency. I just learned it in a painful way first." Dr. Morales made notes. "The salt water incident, do you think it was necessary?" "I think it was inevitable," Margaret said. "Given my circumstances and my understanding of the situation at that moment, yes. Would I do it again? No. Do I think it was moral? I'm genuinely uncertain. It was justified in a very narrow sense. I was desperate. I'd exhausted legitimate remedies, and I acted. But that doesn't make it right." "What would have helped instead?" "A fence," Margaret said. "Authority, being listened to. A community that took property rights seriously. The same Henderson kids' parents being willing to acknowledge their kid was wrong from day one instead of doubling down." The research project continued through May and into the summer. Margaret spoke with Dr. Morales multiple times, and the criminology professor brought her insights to a larger framework she was developing about community responsibility and accountability. In June, Dr. Morales sent Margaret the draft of a paper where Margaret's case study appeared under a pseudonym, though Dr. Morales had asked permission first. Reading about herself as Case Study 4, Suburban Homeowners' Extralegal Response to Chronic Trespassing, Margaret felt a strange distance from the events. They became data points, patterns, part of a larger story about how communities failed and how people responded when communities failed them. It was useful, that distance. It allowed her to see that her story wasn't unique or special. It was a variation on a pattern that played out across neighborhoods constantly. The systems designed to protect property and enforce boundaries were often inadequate, and when people felt unheard, they escalated. That wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation, and explanation was the first step toward prevention. By late summer, the pool had become something Margaret had stopped thinking of as hers in the possessive sense. It was still her property, legally and literally, but it had become part of the neighborhood fabric in a way she hadn't anticipated or planned. Parents thanked her for giving their kids a safe place to swim and a place to learn responsibility. The teenagers themselves had started initiating their own rules, an honor system about cleaning, about respecting one another's space, about not inviting people without asking first. They'd learned the lesson not through salt water, but through actual community. One evening in late July, exactly 1 year after the incident, Margaret stood at the pool's edge watching the Thursday evening session. 30 teenagers in the water, their voices carrying through the warm night, Tyler helping Sarah Marie teach a beginner to float, the fence a clear boundary that everyone respected. She thought about the moment she'd poured the salt, the intoxication of power, the terror that had followed, and the year of reckoning that had led to this. A pool that was hers but also not, a space that was protected by clear boundaries and community respect instead of chemical weapons. She hadn't solved anything. The problems that had driven her to salt water were still real. A police system that had failed her, a community that had been slow to respond, a legal system designed for the wealthy. But she'd learned to work within and around those systems rather than explode them. That wasn't the ending she would have written a year ago. A year ago, she would have wanted vindication, wanted the teenagers punished, wanted some clear victory where everyone acknowledged that she'd been right and they'd been wrong. But the ending she'd gotten was more complicated, and she was beginning to understand, more real. It was the ending where people learned and grew slowly and imperfectly, where a woman who'd been violated found ways to protect herself that didn't require becoming something she didn't recognize, where a neighborhood began to build actual community instead of just being people who happened to live near one another. And it was the ending where the pool became, finally, what it had always been meant to be. Not a battleground, not a sanctuary of fear, but simply a place where people could gather, with boundaries clearly marked and respected, and float together under the stars. Margaret stood in her hospital break room, watching the snow fall outside the window, and reflected on how strange time had become, how it could stretch and compress, how a single moment could contain a lifetime of consequence. 2 years had passed since she'd poured the salt. That time the neighborhood had changed. The Hendersons had moved, not because of shame, but because Robert's company had relocated him to Northern California. Before they left, Robert and Jennifer had come to Margaret's door with a bottle of wine and a genuine conversation. Tyler had scored a scholarship to a decent college and was studying environmental science, something that had sparked during his community service. He still ran past her house sometimes when he was home, and they always waved. Sarah Marie had thrived at UC Davis. Margaret had her on her Instagram, watched from a distance as the girl became a woman, as her environmental justice work began to take real shape. Last fall, she'd sent Margaret a photo from her internship at the UC Davis Wildlife Care Hospital with a caption, "Still learning from that pool experience, still grateful for the hard lessons." The swimming program had become the community program. The city had actually partnered with Margaret to make it official, with a small stipend that didn't cover all her time but validated the work as important. She'd trained 2 other community members to help run it, creating redundancy so it didn't depend entirely on her goodwill. "You're thinking about something serious," a voice said. Margaret turned to see Carlos, her colleague, with 2 cups of coffee. "Just remembering," she said, taking one of the cups. "The pool situation, it's been 2 years exactly." "The salt pool?" Carlos asked, settling onto the break room couch. "That's still legendary around here, you know. I've told new hires and they're always shocked it was you. You're like the nicest person who works here." Margaret smiled at that. People are contradictory. "Yeah," Carlos said. "They are. But I think most people would have done something similar if they were in your position. I think the interesting part isn't that you used salt. It's that you eventually built something better out of it." The academic paper Dr. Morales had been working on was published in the fall of that second year, in a peer-reviewed journal called Community Studies Quarterly. Margaret's case, still pseudonymous, but detailed enough that anyone who was looking could find her, was presented not as an example of homeowner vigilantism, but as a case study in how community failures create individual escalation, and how recovery involves building actual community systems instead of just legal frameworks. The paper caught the attention of other researchers. Margaret was invited to speak at a criminology conference. She declined at first, but then accepted. She spoke about what it felt like to be unheard, about the moment she realized she had power, about the consequences of using that power without community framework, and about the slow work of building something more sustainable. The talk was recorded and put on YouTube, and it had a fraction of the views of the original viral incident, but the comments were different. People weren't arguing about whether she'd been right or wrong. They were discussing systems, suggesting community solutions, talking about how neighborhood associations might better support residents dealing with trespassing. One comment from someone identifying as a middle school teacher said, "I'm using this as a case study in my civics class about when personal remedies become community problems. This is better than any textbook I could assign." By the second anniversary, Margaret had almost stopped thinking about the salt water as a defining moment. She'd lived through it, learned from it, and moved forward. Life had compressed the drama into a story she could tell without being defined by it. Then, in July of the second summer, the police called. "Mrs. Chen?" The officer's voice was vaguely familiar. It was Martinez, the older officer from 2 years ago. "I'm calling about a situation in the neighborhood. We received multiple reports of teenagers trespassing into several swimming pools, including 2 with attempted break-ins. We're wondering if you've experienced any incidents recently." Margaret's heart jumped, a residual fear response from 2 years prior. "No," she said. "We haven't had any trespassing. I have a community program in the evenings. Teenagers come with permission, and I haven't had any after-hours incidents." "Yeah, that's what I figured," Martinez said. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. We've been using your swimming program as a model for the rest of the neighborhood. The captain asked me to reach out and see if you'd be willing to help train other homeowners about creating supervised community spaces instead of instead of creating hostile spaces or calling us repeatedly." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. I would be interested in that, yes." "Great, I'll send you some details. And Mrs. Chen? For what it's worth, I think what you built here is better than what you did 2 years ago. Not that I blame you for it, but creating actual community, this is the real solution." By late summer of the second year, Margaret had trained 5 other homeowners in the neighborhood on how to establish similar community swimming programs. A homeowner 2 streets over started a community garden on her property with the same model: invited, supervised, with clear boundaries and shared responsibility. The police department, surprisingly, became an advocate. They started promoting the programs as a community engagement strategy. When teenagers had somewhere safe and supervised to go, where they were part of something rather than outside of it, they were less likely to trespass or commit small crimes. The numbers backed it up. Property crime in the neighborhood had decreased 40% in the 2 years since Margaret started the pool program. On the exact second anniversary of the salt incident, Margaret decided to do something symbolic. She cleaned the pool completely, drained it, replaced the water fresh, and had it professionally treated. When it was full and sparkling under the summer sun, she stood at the edge of it and thought about everything that had come from that one night of rage and salt and power. She'd hurt people. She'd been justified in protecting her boundaries, but the method she'd chosen had been cruel. The consequences had been real. But from those consequences, from the public reckoning and her own internal reckoning, something good had emerged, not just for her, but for her neighborhood, for other people dealing with similar issues. It wasn't redemption exactly. She'd done a thing that required consequences, and she'd lived through them, but it was something like growth. That evening, the Thursday program ran as it always did. 40 teenagers in the water, the boundary fence clearly marking where permission ended. Some of them were from wealthy families. Some were from working-class ones. Some had a history of trespassing. Some had a history of being trespassed upon. They swam together in the space Margaret had created, respecting boundaries not because they feared consequences, but because they understood why boundaries mattered. Tyler was home from college, helping teach as he sometimes did. Sarah Marie's little brother had joined the program this year, learning to swim from teenagers who'd learned from a woman who'd taught them with salt water before teaching them with actual community. As Margaret watched them, she thought about the title that had started everything. They kept sneaking into her pool, so she replaced the water with salt and they screamed. It was a good title. It was dramatic and attention-grabbing and technically accurate, but it wasn't the real story. The real story was messier, more complicated, more human. A woman had felt violated and powerless, so she'd used power in a way she'd later recognize as imperfect. But from that imperfect action, through reckoning and reflection and community building, she'd found a better way to protect what was hers while also building something larger than herself. That wasn't as catchy a title, it didn't go viral, but it was truer. As the sun set and the teenagers started getting out of the water, drying off, chatting about plans for the rest of the summer, Margaret felt a deep, bone-deep sense of peace. Not from victory, not from vindication, but from the knowledge that she'd lived through something difficult and come out on the other side having learned something real about herself and about community. The pool glimmered in the twilight, a boundary clearly marked, a space carefully maintained, a sanctuary that had become shared without being violated. It had taken salt and consequence and reckoning to get there. But it had been worth every burning sensation, every lawsuit threat, every moment of doubt.